Now, as the name of the video implies, this is the 6th part of a story, so if you haven't seen the first several parts yet, I'd highly recommend checking them out first, or this likely isn't going to make any sense to you. Links to them will be found in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We start by getting a shot of the entrance to the Sith Temple on Malachor, before we're taken inside and find Luke and Ahsoka in the midst of a conversation. They're now in a small room lit only by torchlight, and containing pieces of ancient Sith armor and weapons that have seen much better days. We then hear Ahsoka say, looking frustrated, even just letting her know about the possibility of retaining consciousness within the cosmic force after death was a mistake, but the idea of teaching her how to actually achieve it in exchange for her help? She finishes with a shake of her head and then turns away from Luke. That's when he says back, what else do I have to offer her but forbidden knowledge and a chance to escape this prison of hers? As strong as she is, she knows she's not strong enough to corrupt me and dominate my mind and leave this place, like she thought she'd be able to do with you when you were much younger and far from what you are today. Ahsoka says nothing to that, and Luke goes on, worry not, my friend. She'll never succeed anyway. It requires the ability to let go of everything, all fears and attachments. And such a thing is clearly beyond one such as her. Knowing the way is one thing, the ability to walk it is another. This I know and understand all too well. Ahsoka then turns her head, looks over her shoulder at Luke and says, you won't be able to let go, will you? If it comes to it, I mean, if your power overwhelms you and you begin to slip to the dark side, you don't think you'll be able to let go and merge with the Force. The hate and anger for Vader, they've already grown too strong within you to overcome. That's what this is all about, isn't it? It's not about learning to control the dark side if you must. You've already accepted the fact that you will try to wield it against him. Luke lowers his eyes to the floor and says, I have accepted nothing beyond the fact that Vader must be stopped at all costs, and what happens to me in the end doesn't matter. Ahsoka turns all the way around now, takes a step towards Luke and says, it does matter when you destroy Vader and just simply take his place. Luke looks up, locks eyes with Ahsoka and says, that's why I'm here, to make sure that doesn't happen, that I can control the dark side without losing myself to it. Luke now takes a step towards Ahsoka and says with an earnest look upon his face, you're proof that it's possible, that the ways of the dark side can be learned without letting it consume you. But Ahsoka shakes her head, gives him a look like he's missing the point and says, yes, they can be learned, but used against another is something else entirely. Remember, Luke, I didn't learn the ways of the dark side to actually wield it. I learned the ways of the dark side simply to understand it, as part of the path of the Bendu. To become one, both sides of the Force must be equally understood. You, though, you want to learn to wield it, to use it to destroy Vader, and I fear that it will cost you everything. Luke then, with an almost helpless expression upon his face, says, what would you have me do then? Vader must be stopped. Ahsoka shuts her eyes, lowers her head a bit, and simply says, I know, but using the dark side against him is a mistake. You must trust in the light, and only learn the ways of the dark side to be able to stop yourself from falling it, to be able to recognize it. To that, Luke shakes his head and turns away from her. He then says, trusting in the light won't stop Vader. Upon hearing that, Ahsoka hangs her head even more, and the two just stand there in silence for some time. Ahsoka then moves towards Luke, lays a hand upon his shoulder, and says, then I'm sorry, my old friend, but this is where our paths part ways once more. Sharing the secrets of immortality with the servant of the dark side is something I simply cannot condone, nor will I watch you walk the path of your own destruction. I know I cannot stop you, nor will I try, but I won't be a part of this either. Luke then gives one nod of the head and simply says, I understand. And that's when there is a flash, and we suddenly find ourselves in the past, and see Luke Skywalker, maybe 20 years younger than he just was, standing upon a flat, grassy world at sunset, and looking upon a newly constructed Jedi temple made of stone, and behind him, with a hand on his shoulder, is not Ahsoka, but another woman, who appears to be perhaps in her 30s, around the same age as Luke at this time, and she has long red hair, and there is a look of great sadness upon her face, and to Luke she says the same thing Ahsoka had just said. I know I cannot stop you, nor will I try, but I won't be a part of this either. And again, Luke simply nods his head once and says, I understand. And that's when the red-haired woman removes her hand from Luke's shoulder, folds her arms, and turns away from him and says as she shuts her eyes, seemingly fighting back tears, "So that's it then. This is where we part ways." After hearing that, Luke turns around and says, "Mara, what choice do I have?" She snaps back at him. "There's always a choice, Luke, and plenty that are better than heading off into the unknown regions in search of Vader, where you're likely just going to get yourself lost in more ways than one." Luke gives a slight, almost helpless shrug and says, "What choice do I have? His power grows almost daily. I can feel it. If I don't stop him now, what will he become? And what will I then have to become to stop him?" Mara frowns and then replies, "What if you're not the one meant to stop him, Luke?" Luke almost chuckles at that and says, "Then who is?" Mara shakes her head a bit, as if it was a silly thought, and then says, I don't know, but maybe you're not the one who will finally end all this." Luke seems to think on that a moment, then says, "Maybe we're meant to stop him together, Mara. Maybe there was a reason the Force brought us together." For some reason, those words seem to bring great pain to Mara, and she folds her arms low across her stomach and averts her gaze, seemingly unable to look at Luke now. "What is it?" Luke then asks, his expression softening. Mara opens her mouth to respond, but then quickly shuts it and seems to say something else. "What do you sense, Luke? What do you feel right now?" Luke gives her a look as if wondering what this is supposed to be about, but then he shuts his eyes and is silent for some time before finally saying, "I sense only rising darkness." Mara replies, "That's it. That's all you can sense and feel right now." Luke only nods and says nothing else, and Mara says, her expression suddenly becoming almost impassive, "Then perhaps you should just go." Looking confused, Luke then says, "You could come with me, Mara. You know of Vader better than I. You could help me find and defeat him." Mara, still looking almost emotionless, then says, "I served as the Emperor's hand, Luke, not Vader's. I'm no expert on your father." Luke then offers a quick apology, and that's when Mara says, waving her hand and gesturing at the newly constructed Jedi Temple, "So what was the point of all this? What was the point of helping me learn the ways of the Jedi, of helping you find students and bringing them to this place, if you were just going to abandon us all?" Luke then looks at the temple and says softly, "If I fail, I need to know the Jedi won't end with me, that there will still be hope." Mara lowers her head a bit and says, "If you leave, I'm not going to stay. Lor Santeka can watch and teach the students till you get back. If you get back." Luke, looking confused, then says, I don't understand." Mara gives him a sad smile and says, "No, Luke, you don't. But if you ever do figure it out, if you ever sense anything besides darkness, come find me. I will be waiting for you." And without another word, Mara turns and simply walks away. Luke watches her go, but neither makes a move to stop her or says anything. After she's gone, Luke then turns and looks upon the Jedi Temple he's created, and lets out what sounds like a rather regretful sigh. There is then another flash, and we now find ourselves back in the present time of the story, and we're still at the Jedi Temple on some flat, grassy world. But now it's the middle of the night, and instead of Luke Skywalker looking upon the temple, illuminated only by moonlight, we see Luke's tall, lanky apprentice Vader looking upon it with a troubled expression upon his all-too-handsome face. That's when we hear a beeping sound, and from his pocket, Vader pulls a small, disc-shaped hollow projector, and hits a button on it, and a small blue image of Jacen Syndulla, wearing Jedi robes, appears to him. Vader then says, "What news from Coruscant, Master Syndulla?" "Not much, I'm afraid," Jacen replies. "It appears as if Senator Solo may not have been abducted after all, but rather gone willingly with a young woman." Vader gives something like a sigh of relief and says, "Well, that sounds like it's good news." But Jacen shakes his head and says back, "Not exactly. It seems as if this young woman may have mind-tricked some guards to get to Senator Solo, so who knows just how willingly he went with her. It also means we're dealing with a Force user." Vader frowns and says, "Master Skywalker mentioned to me once how eager Ben Solo was to learn the ways of the Force, despite a lack of a strong connection to it. Maybe he hired her to try and train him, or is being scammed by her." Jacen seems to think a moment, then nods. "I suppose something like that is possible. Either way, with Master Skywalker gone, it's up to us to deal with the Force user and find the Senator." Vader gives a grim smile and says, yes, I suppose it is. So, what exactly can I do to help then?" Jacen then replies, "For now, nothing. I'm going to head down into the lower levels of the city and see what, if anything, I can find about this young woman with Force powers. Likely won't turn up anything, but there's not much else to go on right now." Vader nods and says that he understands, and the image of Jason Syndulla then flickers and fades away, and Vader then puts the holo projector back into his pocket. But when he pulls his hand back out, he is now holding the small dark stone that Luke gave to him. For a few seconds then, he just looks it over, and we can see the struggle within his blue eyes, the struggle of one contemplating doing something he knows he shouldn't. He then starts to put it back into his pocket, but sighs, grumbles something about not wanting to let down his master, and then takes a deep breath and holds the stone up before him and closes his eyes. A moment later, a spark comes from the stone that zaps Vader and causes him to cry out in pain as he drops it into the tall grass at his feet. With a trace of anger upon his face, he bends down, retrieves the stone, and again shuts his eyes and seems to try to concentrate upon it. This time, a soft glow comes from the stone, and when Vader opens his eyes, he, and we, see an image of a tall, pale, twisted figure seated upon an elevated throne made of crumbling stone. And we of course recognize this figure to be Snoke, and see that he sits in a vast, dimly lit chamber lined with broken stone pillars. And standing before him in this chamber is Luke Skywalker, appearing maybe 20 years younger than he'd be at the present time of this story, or about the same age, or a little older perhaps, than we saw him in the memory of Mara Jade we saw moments ago. We then watch as Snoke leans forward and says to Luke, "Not the one you were expecting to find, am I?" Luke, his expression calm, then says, "Who are you? What are you?" Snoke replies, "Clearly I am not your father, who you have wandered around the unknown regions in search of for years, trying to trace the source of a dark presence you felt, a presence you wrongly assumed was that of Darth Vader." After hearing that, we see on Luke's face that his mind has started racing, but before he can say anything, Snoke says, "Oh, fear not, Skywalker. Your feelings have not completely failed you. Your father still lives, though the rising darkness you have felt has not been him, or at least not entirely him, but rather you have sensed my powers, after the coming of a chosen one awoke me from a very long slumber. And since then I have been manipulating the course of events in the galaxy in the hopes of bringing you here." Luke, now looking completely confused, then asks, "Why? Why bring me here?" Snoke leans ever closer towards Luke and says, "It was the first of the Jedi that trapped me within this place, and it was said that it shall be the last of the Jedi that frees me." To that, Luke lifts his head proudly and boldly declares, "I am not the last of the Jedi." Snoke smiles at that and says, "No, perhaps you are referring to your young students that you left behind, a collection of half-trained children who don't hold a speck of your raw potential." Snoke's smile then grows, and then he says, "Or perhaps you refer to another. Unfortunately for you, though, as you hunted him, as you hunted what you thought was Vader, only to find and free me, Vader has been hunting her." Immediately, all the confusion leaves Luke's face and is replaced by a look of painful regret, and he mutters only one word, "Mara." Seemingly without thought, Luke's hand falls to his side, and he takes hold of his saber, ignites it, and holds the green-bladed weapon out before him. That's when Snoke begins to clap, his smile larger than ever, and he says, "You're finally beginning to see the bigger picture, Skywalker, but not all of it, I think." Luke then says, "What does Vader want with Mara?" Snoke gives a big, exaggerated shrug and says, "What indeed would Vader want with her?" Without another word, Luke charges at Snoke with his saber blazing and the anger upon his face clear. And Snoke casually raises a hand and makes a simple dismissive gesture with it, and Luke is knocked back and up into the air. But as he's falling backwards, Luke manages to do a flip, gracefully lands on his feet, and without hesitation, immediately charges at Snoke again. The amused look on Snoke's face is now replaced by one of slight concern, and he gets to his feet and raises a hand and holds it palm out towards Luke, and Luke is instantly frozen in place, and is held there for several long seconds until he shuts his eyes, concentrates for a moment, and breaks the hold and continues to charge. Quickly then, Snoke, with a look of worry on his face now, holds out his other hand, and from it springs forth red lightning, which causes Luke to stop, hold up his saber, and block it. And as Snoke continues to shoot lightning, he says, "I feel your anger, Skywalker, and the strength it gives you is frightening, isn't it?" Luke says nothing to that, but instead manages to take a few steps forward as he continues to block the red lightning being shot at him. Snoke then says, his eyes becoming almost distant now, as if he's seeing something else entirely. And on his face is fear, and he says, I see it now, how this will all end, what you will become. A servant of the dark side, more powerful than any that have ever come before. For a moment after hearing that, Luke seems to falter, but then a look of resolve comes over him, and with all his might he pushes his lightsaber forward, and the lightning starts to reflect back at Snoke, who stops immediately when it strikes him. The two then stare at each other in silence for a brief moment before Snoke says, You seen it too, didn't you? What you are destined to become if you are to ever stop Vader. Luke says nothing to that, and instead draws back his saber and throws it up at Snoke. And before the spinning green blade reaches him, Snoke turns his head and seems to lock eyes with Vader, who, of course, has been watching all of this in the image cast by the stone he holds, and Snoke simply says to him, You, which causes Vader to jump, and he drops the stone and the image quickly fades away. But not before we see the spinning blade slice through Snoke's neck and remove his head from his shoulders. That's when we switch scenes, and we now find ourselves with Darth Ison, who sits in the cockpit of her small black wedge-shaped ship as it skims across the desert surface of the planet Jakku. And since she doesn't have on her helmet, we are able to see a look of absolute rage and anger upon her face, as way off in the distance, on the horizon, we can see a small dwelling that we can only assume is where Rey and Ben Solo are. That's when, in her mind, we can hear the voice of Darth Vader say to her, My apprentice, you must not do this. I command you to return to my Star Destroyer. But hearing that only seems to strengthen her resolve, and she punches some buttons on the console before her, and we see a targeting system come to life. We then again hear the voice of Vader, and it says, Darth Ison, you will obey me. You will obey your master. Unfazed and drawing ever closer to the dwelling, we now see Darth Ison lock onto it with the ship's weapons. And that is when we hear the voice, not of Vader, but of Anakin Skywalker, the old Anakin Skywalker. And it says to her, Erba, you mustn't do this, my child. That's when there is a flash, and we now see Mara Jade running through a forest made up of tall, thin trees with glimmering white barks, and capped off with plumages of deep purple leaves. In her arms, she carries a child, a young girl maybe 3 years of age who, also like her, has red hair. Suddenly Mara comes to a halt when she hears the sound of a lightsaber igniting and the sound of mechanical breathing. And standing before her now, crimson-bladed lightsaber in his hands, is Darth Vader. Completely out of breath, Mara sets the child down and looks into her eyes and simply says, Erba, run, and don't you ever stop until the day your father finally comes for you. The child looks confused and doesn't seem to understand or like she even wants to obey, until Mara turns her around, gives her a little smack on the backside, and tells her to go and not look back. And now the young girl begins to take off running. Mara then gets back to her feet and slowly turns around and faces Vader. She then says, taking hold of a lightsaber that hangs from her belt, You've come for her, haven't you? This has always been about her, not about some need to find and destroy me. Vader then replies, As if I would have wasted all this time to hunt down a failed hand of my old master. Those words seem to sting Mara Jade on some level, and her only response is to ignite her lightsaber and attack Vader, who easily and effortlessly blocks her first attack. Mara then takes a few more swings at Vader, who again almost lazily blocks her attacks, holding the saber in just one hand. Vader then goes on the offensive, and his slow yet brutally powerful and methodical attacks easily start to push her back, and it isn't long until Vader makes a swing that severs Mara's arm at the elbow, and she screams out in pain and drops to her knees, clutching at the stump with her other hand. Vader then stands over Mara, saber pointed at her, and says, Your faith in Skywalker and his teachings have been your undoing. I offered to make you my apprentice when our master was destroyed, to teach you true power, and now I shall make the same offer to another. Vader glances up, and Mara follows his gaze and sees that her daughter, Erba, hasn't run very far, but instead hides behind a nearby tree with just her head poking out from behind it. That's when Mara turns her head back around, looks up at Vader, and defiantly says, No matter what you do to her, Vader, you will never fully eclipse the light within her. She will never be a true servant of the dark side. She will never be yours. She will be your undoing. we then watch as Vader draws back his saber and swings it. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part of the story and what might happen next. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.